Well, we welcome you again to our last summer series lesson on what it means to love our neighbor. This has been a great series to explore and to encourage us to really think about not just ourselves, but to think about those around us. So today, what we're going into is the last chapter of the book of Ruth. It's Ruth chapter 4. And as we get into Ruth 4 today, we're going to see a lot of things, but I think the most encouraging thing that we're going to see today really has to do with the fact of focusing on God's incredible love, God's incredible grace that has been poured out to us, and how that really directs you and I to live for a greater kingdom. It calls you and I to live for something greater and bigger than ourselves. And that's exciting to really think about, that that's what the purpose of God's love is that we live for Him, what He wants, His ways. And so as we get into Ruth 4, we're going to see that in the life of Boaz. But I'm reminded of when Jesus taught in Matthew 6:33, when He said, "But seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things will be added to you." You know, when Jesus was teaching this, He was talking about food and needs and clothing and all these things that the disciples and this large crowd were concerned with. And Jesus told them, "Seek first my kingdom, and then all these things will be added to you." You know, I think the reality as we get into this lesson, we often see in our own lives that you and I get stifled and tripped up in all these things. We often, our needs are important, and we should think about those things and pursue those things, of course. But often we put those things often before God's kingdom. We get tripped up, we get caught up in the worldly wisdom and these pursuits of good things, but it keeps us from thinking about the greater kingdom often that is at hand. And you know, the answer to that issue, that problem within our own hearts, is to see the love of God, to see His covenantal faithfulness, His graciousness towards us, and then we live out of that. That's what we see here in the book of Ruth, especially in chapter 4. We see Boaz is a man who has been captured by God's kingdom, who is seeing the faithfulness of Yahweh, and he can't help to live for something bigger than himself. And we see this over and over all throughout. So again, let us be encouraged that there is right motivation, there is right power when we focus on what Christ has done for us. Well, let's get into chapter 4 and let this kind of unfold as we walk through it. Look at verses 1 through 6 with me. It says, "Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down. And behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, 'Turn aside, my friend, sit down here.' And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, 'Sit down here.' So they sat down. Then he said to the Redeemer, 'Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought that I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here, and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me, that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you.' And he said, 'I will redeem it.' Then Boaz said, 'The day that you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance.' Then the Redeemer said, 'I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it.'" You know, we were left from chapter 3 at the threshing floor. And so here in chapter 4, we move to the situation where Boaz leaves the threshing floor and goes quickly to deal with this situation with Ruth's ask on the threshing floor. And so as we see here, he goes to the gate, he finds this closer redeemer, this kinsman redeemer, and at the gate, he gathers witnesses, gathers the elders. The gate was a place of business, a place of judgment, a place where a lot of transactions, all these things took place during this day. And what Boaz does is he lays out the situation to this closer kinsman redeemer. But in that, he says that Naomi is selling this land. Now, I do think it's important to ask ourselves, well, what does that mean? Because this does relate to what we're talking about. You know, what Naomi was trying to do, she was not trying to get rid of the land. She was not trying to move away from it and have nothing to do with it. When it says that she was selling the land, she was actually selling the use of the land, or she was selling the future crops or the future harvest that was coming. And you know, someone could have bought the use of the land. They could have come along and that would have been a help to Naomi in some part. But in reality, the issue that's at hand that we even referenced last time is that there is no heir. There is no son. There is no one to continue the name of Elimelech, the family name. And so the problem that's here is that Naomi and Elimelech's name and his land could be erased from God's community. You know, even with the year of Jubilee, when all debts and all things were canceled and things were given back to people, there is still an issue here of the heir with no heir. Elimelech's name could be erased totally from the community. And that means the world to Naomi. That means life. That is the provision. That is God's their stake in God's community, his people. And so, if you remember back on the threshing floor, Ruth asked for all of that. In her somewhat proposal of marriage to Boaz, she is thinking about an heir. She is thinking about an heir for the sake of Naomi, for the name of Elimelech. And so as Boaz lays this out to this kinsman redeemer, we begin to see what happens. You know, I think it's also important to pause and to look at who we're introduced to, this closer kinsman redeemer. Boaz says, "Turn aside, my friend." And it's interesting here that his name is not mentioned. That actually is quite a big deal. It's even in the sense that his name is not to be remembered. And even when you look at the Hebrew word, when he says my friend, there's actually a negative connotation on this man. It's translated to something like this, like Mr. Such and Such or Mr. So and So. And this reflects poorly on this man's character. And so as we remember that, Boaz lays out this situation. He encourages him to buy the use of the land from Naomi, but then he, in a very wise kind of strategy, lays out it also includes the marriage to Ruth, this Moabite woman. And so Mr. So-and-so, or this closer redeemer, as we will call him, Mr. So-and-so somewhat exposes himself at this point. You see that his decision not to redeem the land is based on the impairment of his own inheritance, which was a true, legitimate concern. But you begin to see in Mr. So-and-so, this closer redeemer, that he's concerned about his own property, his own family line, his own inheritance. And we begin to see, and in somewhat a business-like attitude, a coldness that his own agenda, his own plans, his own convenience becomes the centerpiece for him. And he decides to pass. And we ask the question, why again is this not good? Is it good to think about our families and to provide? Yes, these are good things. But here we begin to see that what's at stake is one of God's own covenant people and their stake in that community. See, what's at stake is something bigger, and God had called all of his people to look after one another. Like I said last week, there is no stimulus check coming in the mail. There's no payroll protection act that's put in place in order. And God's people were called to look after one another. And ultimately just buying the use of the land would have helped Naomi, but it would not have solved the problem at hand, the fact that there was no heir. And so I think we have to deduce that Mr. So-and-so is getting caught up in all these things. He is thinking about his own kingdom. But on the flip side, we begin to see this contrast. We begin to see that Boaz is being almost contrasted with Mr. So-and-so here. We begin to see that in this story, as we have already seen, Boaz is a man who is willing to go beyond what is expected. He is a man who is willing to go beyond even what the law calls God's people to do. And what that involves, as we see, is self-sacrifice at a great cost. There is love that is being poured out here. We see this in the life of Boaz, again, because he is a man who has come to know Yahweh. And so we're going to see even more how this comes out in the rest of the chapter, but I think there's something important to even address at this point. Many have often said that Boaz's motivation is being pushed by this romantic love, that his self-sacrifice, that his willing to give up so much is only through romantic love. Now, we acknowledge that the text is very clear that Boaz wanted to marry Ruth. We see here at the gate his kind of wise strategy of pursuing this Mr. So-and-so and the way he talks to him. And at the end of chapter 3, we see that Boaz wants to quickly deal with this situation in order for Ruth and also Naomi. But even if there was this romantic attraction or this love that was there, that is not the point of what God is wanting us to see. Nothing wrong with that, but God is wanting us again to see that His grace transforms His people in order to give ourselves away for others. We see this more. Look at with me in verses 7 through 10. It says, "Now this was a custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other. And this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, 'Buy it for yourself,' he drew off his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, 'You are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech, and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. And also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day.'" What we see here in Boaz is this self-sacrifice for something bigger. In reality, when Boaz secures the land, when he redeems all that belonged to Elimelech, it was at a huge cost to him. We don't know much about Boaz and his family, and if he had a wife or if he had a wife pass away, we're not told that. But in truth, what we do know is that Boaz now is having to take his resources, is having to take his means, and he's got 2 lands, 2 families, more responsibility. And this is at a huge cost to Boaz. And in the marrying of Ruth, Boaz again, we see this pouring himself out because he's thinking for an heir for Naomi's sake. But it's so important that we see these things. We do have to pause and ask, well, what do we do about this phrase when it says that basically Boaz bought Ruth to be his wife? Well, I think it's important to remember, has Boaz treated Ruth like a piece of property throughout this book? And the answer is no. He has often put himself at level with Ruth. He's taken away the ethnic tensions, and he has loved her like a person that's been made in the image of God. And it's also to remember that this language of bought is within this whole transaction of the redemption. With the property, Elimelech's name, all of this. And that actually drives us to Jesus, because what Jesus did at the cross was that he purchased his people. There was a spiritual transaction going on that cost Jesus his life. And so don't be concerned about this language. There is more going on here than just what is at sight. But Boaz acts in all integrity. He does things right, but he moves forward in great compassion, great generosity, and great unselfishness. Boaz, we could say at this point, is clearly living for the greater kingdom. He is realizing that life is not about just himself. He is thinking about God's kingdom. And how true does this point us to Jesus? You think about Philippians 2, where it talks about how Christ willingly laid aside his own glory in order to come to be with a people who were great sinners. And Christ was willing to lay these things aside and even to be obedient to the point of death in order for God's kingdom to continue. And you and I get the benefit of that. We see this self-sacrifice, this love that is centered in the person of Christ. Well, as the chapter continues, we also see some other good things. We see this recognizing of God's hand in this situation. Look with me in verses 11 and 12. It says, "Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, 'We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrath, and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman.'" What's so striking here is that these elders, these witnesses, they actually, as they are praying for these things or wanting these things to happen, that Boaz and Ruth and their children would be like Rachel and Leah, the really foundation of God's nation. They are wanting God's kingdom, God's nation to continue, but they are recognizing here that God is at work. Just saying that and pointing back to Rachel and Leah, they are starting to see that God is redeeming this situation. And even in the fact that they bring up the situation with Judah and Tamar in Genesis 38. Here was a Levirate marriage that took place, one that was very messy, one that's even out of sin, where this situation took place. But God took a horrible situation and did his redemptive work through it. That even the line of Christ comes through this, and that God used that to change Judah's life. That was really the turning point in Judah's life, that he was a man of faith after that growing that we see through the rest of Genesis. And so there is this recognition that God is at work, and the people want God to continue to work. We see it in the last set of verses here in chapter 4, which is a beautiful portrait of God's work at hand. Verses 13 through 22 says this: "So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the woman said to Naomi, Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, A son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Amminadab. Amminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. And Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered David. You know, in this kind of long end of the chapter here, in this genealogy that's laid out, we see that ultimately God has redeemed this situation. And we even see that what God is doing on the bigger scale. God is directing to King David. God is ultimately directing to Christ. That we begin to see that this kinsman-redeemer motif, this theme of Redeemer is drawing us to Christ. It is helping us see that in Boaz there is even someone greater, one who truly self-sacrificed, lays his life down for us. So I think in light of that, in the end of this book and this chapter, I think there's some important applications, even for this whole study, as we've looked at loving our neighbor. I think the first thing that we have to ask ourselves, or have to consider, to be honest, is that you and I can often live like Mr. So-and-so. That we often think first about our own kingdoms. We think first about our own security, our own safety. We live on human wisdom. I think we have to be honest with ourselves that that can be us. I think secondly, there's a call here, an application, to love and to desire God's kingdom more than anything else. You know, that is the key, is that we would value by looking at the love and the faithfulness of who God is, and that will propel us as husbands and wives to lay ourselves down for one another, to submit to each other out of reverence for Christ, to parent our children, our grandchildren, that we would look at them and love them not as a bother but as an opportunity to be faithful. That you and I would look at our time, our gifts, our talents, our money, as these are opportunities to bless others. That is living for God's kingdom. And then last, I would say, it's also an opportunity for you and I to see our faithfulness as we walk by faith as the opportunity for God's redemptive work. Not that we force God's hand, but that God uses our faithfulness in His sovereignty to impact the life of others.